All right, hello. I am Rachel Ellis, an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you to Dr. Eason for the invitation, as well as the Watson Institute and the Urban Institute for supporting this generative event. So as we settle in with lunch, we are coming off the heels of a compelling and thought-provoking panel about abolition. And as we continue to make strides towards moratorium and decarceration, it remains urgent to address what is currently happening inside prisons. With more than 1.2 million people incarcerated in state and federal prisons in the United States, we need to make practical and policy recommendations for what we can change in the here and now. And I know much of this panel may focus on labor, but I'm going to focus my comments on another very important institution within prisons, that of religion. On March 28, 2019, the Supreme Court of the United States granted a stay of execution for Patrick Henry Murphy of Texas on the grounds of religious discrimination. As a practicing Buddhist, Murphy asked that his execution be stayed until Texas approved a Buddhist spiritual advisor to be present in the execution chamber with him at the time of his lethal injection. In the executions before Murphy, Christian and Muslim men on death row all had a chaplain of their faith tradition present with them in the chamber. But there was no Buddhist chaplain in the Texas Department of Corrections. They could not accommodate Murphy's request. Instead, they offered that Murphy's Buddhist advisor, Reverend Shi, who had been ministering to him for the past 6 years, could instead observe his execution in the viewing chamber. The Supreme Court found this unacceptable. In dicta, Justice Kavanaugh wrote that governmental discrimination against the free exercise of religion violates the Constitution. He proposed two potential remedies. One, allow all religious advisors inside the execution chamber. Or two, allow no religious advisors in the execution chamber and relegate them all to the viewing room. The unconstitutional part is allowing spiritual advisors of some religions in and not others. The Texas Department of Corrections may choose that second option, no religious advisors in the execution chamber, because, as Kavanaugh wrote in his statement, quote, "A state may choose a remedy in which it would allow religious advisors only into the viewing room and not the execution room because there are operational and security issues associated with an execution by lethal injection." 5 days later, Texas changed its policy and now relegates all religious ministers to the viewing room and not the execution chamber. This case illuminates the crux of what I'd like to discuss today. It represents the tensions that the state grapples with every day as it confines people. As we know, incarceration is much more than locking up and throwing away the key. As state-run institutions, prisons must attend to the constitutional rights of those locked inside. Debates around religious freedom in prison are a crucible for the interaction of competing rules and rights. My refrain in this talk will be, in the name of security. First, I'll take a moment to describe my own research and then the empirical basis for what I will later argue. I spent a year conducting ethnographic fieldwork inside a U.S. state women's prison that I call Mapleside. All names of people and places are pseudonyms. My research involved 12 months of observations and interviews with hundreds of incarcerated women and prison staff. The focus of my study was religious life inside prison. And my book on this topic was published last year. So, religion, why? Sure, lots of Americans are religious. Sure, religion can be a primary framework through which people make sense of their lives, but we're academics, so isn't religion some kind of peripheral, less important issue? In my research, I argue that religion is not a side issue, but rather central to the very foundation of punishment. Think Christian reformers shaping prisons as we know them, the penitentiary, penitence, I'll leave it there for now. But more than that, religion tells us something really important about how state power operates on the inside. Why? Because religion has a specially protected place in this country, unlike most other prison rights, for two reasons. One, the inalienable right of free exercise of religion under the First Amendment. The other comes down to the RLPA, rolls off the tongue. The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, which is current law, mandating that states accepting federal funds for prison operations should create no burden to restrict the exercise of religion in prison, unless in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest, and through the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest. Compelling governmental interest is key in the name of security. So what is religious accommodation in practice? Personal property, the stuff and things, the ritual items of one's faith tradition, a rosary, a prayer mat, a kufi, a prayer shawl. Communal activities, one worship service and one scriptural study each week. Mass and a Bible study, Jummah and a Quranic study. Grooming exceptions, being permitted to grow a beard or to wear a hijab or khimar. Work exemptions, such as not working on holidays or rest days. And finally, special diets like kosher and halal meals. And it varies by state. Here's a memorandum from the Tennessee Department of Correction showing the ritual items permitted based on religious affiliation. At issue is that the RLPA is subject to compelling state interests. As Kavanaugh wrote regarding Murphy's stay of execution, quote, "The state has a compelling interest in controlling access to the execution room, which means that an inmate likely cannot prevail on a RLPA or free exercise claim to have a religious minister in the execution room as opposed to the viewing room, in the name of security." My question for Kavanaugh and for the policymakers here today, whether in person or over the web, would be, why is having a Buddhist advisor a security issue, but it was never an issue with the imam or the Christian chaplain? Is it really security? Or is it security, the cloak protecting the state's precious discretion underneath? Here's where my research comes in. A strength of qualitative research is that we can see what's happening in real life, how what's written in the books plays out in everyday life. What I found is that when prison officials accommodate religious practice, they oversee it. They get to dictate what is allowed and what is not allowed. And it can lead to real inequalities. And these inequalities are unacceptable when it comes to depriving people of their constitutional rights. The core issue is discretion. Discretion fueled by the language of the RLPA, unless in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest. Almost anything can be so in the name of security. I'll share just a few examples from my research. When Jewish women wanted to complete the ritual lighting of Sabbath candles on Friday night, they had to ask an officer to do it for them because they are not allowed to handle an open flame. I observed as an officer declined to do so. She did not want to leave her post, even though she had just a few moments prior. Denied in the name of security. Muslim women wanted to fast for Ramadan. The accommodation was to be permitted into the cafeteria before sunrise and after sunset for meals. One woman's request was not approved because she had, quote, converted to Islam too recently. Denied in the name of security. A Wiccan group got shut down because they, quote, weren't taking it seriously. Denied in the name of security. Prison officials have decided that they are not in the business of enforcing religious practice. They are supposed to accommodate, but not enforce. In practice, though, it's difficult to accomplish one without the other. Take the kosher meal plan. There are regulations in some states to guard against perceived misuse of the kosher meal plan. For instance, in Virginia, anyone eating non-kosher food is charged 70 cents per meal if they signed up for the kosher meal plan. A steep price in light of prison wages. Mapleside instated a 3 strikes rule for Jewish women. If she ordered non-kosher items from the commissary or non-kosher food in the cafeteria line, after 3 times, she was permanently removed from kosher meal plan, no questions asked. There is no room for flexible religious practice. Fundamentally, it's a test of who has the final say. Religious freedom meant to be protected, separate and apart from governmental rule, or prisons, state power. Decidedly, it's the latter. We are talking about the state's coercive arm casting a long shadow over the other rights it purports to protect, with religion being a key example. So how do we move forward? I have 3 recommendations. As we saw in the case of Patrick Murphy in Texas, unfortunately, the solution to inequality has been to remove rights. Muslims in Virginia filed a lawsuit against a Christian God pod that offered better housing and privileges based on religious affiliation. As attorneys for the Council on American Islamic Relations said, people incarcerated in this country do not lose their right to practice religion. All incarcerated individuals in our country deserve to be treated well, not just those who sign up for a Bible-based program. The solution for the Virginia courts? Not better housing for all, not more freedoms within the prison for all, more dignity. Instead, no more God pod. As I hope I've made clear, taking away rights in the name of equality should not be the solution. Thinking about prisons as a state institution like any other, like public schools, we know that states are responsible for certain aspects of the care of their wards. Chipping away at religious rights means chipping away at the few protections available to people in prison. No more of that. We need to better accommodate religious practice by seeking more opportunities for people to practice their faith, not fewer. As a country, we seem to be figuring out how to accommodate religion in public schools without taking away religious rights of students. Why shouldn't we be able to do that for prisons? This is a time in history when the Supreme Court seems to be especially concerned with religious freedom. In a lot of cases, this protection of religious freedom has led to outcomes that are harmful and discriminatory. Is it possible to capitalize in a positive way on this amenability to religious freedom, to bring cases to the courts in a way that could actually benefit incarcerated individuals? A piece of my practical suggestion has to do with the procedural aspect of prison grievances. Usually, people in prison represent themselves in the early stages of filing a grievance of any kind, be it religious or otherwise. They make their case to the internal review board within a Department of Corrections, but as lawyers in the room will know, but most of us lay people will not, it is necessary at that early stage to preserve issues. So for instance, to make the case of religious discrimination, the person incarcerated filing a grievance would need to explicitly state that to preserve the issue in the preliminary stages. One very clear, practical recommendation would be for lawyers to disseminate this information to make sure all incarcerated people not only know their rights, but how to represent themselves in such a situation to be eligible for further appeal stages. The final and biggest solution has to do with prison discretion, tackling my refrain in the name of security. Ultimately, if discretion is carte blanche for the state, that's where we need to intervene. What do we do in other areas where discretion threatens justice? We fight for transparency. We bear witness, and we demand accountability. Prison officials should be held to task when claiming security risk. It cannot be a catch-all. Prisons can no longer be places where bad faith activity goes unchecked. Religious freedom may be a touchstone. Religious freedom is where we see rights being violated on one level. And of course, there are many other levels. There's physical violence and abuse being perpetrated by staff, and that also goes unchecked. Brutality that may be explained away by those in power in the name of security, staff self-defense. We need to start treating prisons like the public institutions that they are, demanding greater accountability, demanding free exercise of hard-fought rights. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Hope your lunch was nice. Thank you to Watson Institute, Brown, of course, Urban Institute, and John for inviting us here. This has been incredible so far, and we're only halfway through. Not even, actually, if we count tomorrow. So just proud to be a part of it. So what I'm going to focus on complements quite well what Professor Ellis just discussed, in particular with that refrain of, in the name of security, the state's discretion. But for my part, I'm going to emphasize how this applies and is relevant to the role of labor within the nation's carceral facilities. Nice. The question that sort of guides my thinking on this, and in particular the elements I'm going to present today, is somewhat simple. What do we know about prison labor conditions historically and today, and also what policy lessons can be learned from this? Now, I can only speak for myself here, although I think it might resonate with some of you in the room, particularly the other sociologists. My training as far as being prepared to really delve into policy debates was not so robust. So I did my best, and I genuinely appreciated this opportunity to do that. So we'll see how it goes. But it's my thinking in terms of policy is informed by two studies primarily, one previous and one ongoing. The previous was an 18-month ethnography within a medium security prison that I call Sunbelt State Penitentiary. I spent 18 months there focusing on and really trying to unpack and learn more about the prison as a workplace, which certainly includes the labor of officials, administrators, and staffers on the ground, but my focus really was on the labor of incarcerated folks themselves and trying to understand how this institution, in addition to being a public institution that should receive full scrutiny along those lines, as Professor Ellis outlined for us, is a workplace, truly, and trying to understand what that meant for the conditions and experiences of those on the inside. And I supplemented my observations with some in-depth interviews speaking not only to incarcerated laborers, but also some staffers and correctional officers when they would speak to me. You'll notice the ends are a little smaller on those groups. At risk of oversimplifying what is ultimately a full book project and some papers, here what I think are some relevant takeaways from the work. First, not all prison jobs are the same. Prison labor is far from monolithic. And as a result of that, nor are all imprisoned laborers treated equally. The access that people have in terms of the jobs opportunities that might be available to them behind bars significantly and dramatically impact their carceral experiences, usually not for the positive. And there are various mechanisms at play that help determine where people get slotted into what I think of as a sort of prison labor market or employment system. And those ultimately come down to varieties of capital that different imprisoned people might have access to or may not have access to, which reflects in a dark sense, in a sort of Black Mirror sense, some of the inequalities and challenges of the outside labor market, but of course amplifies and exacerbates inequalities suffered by those who are found struggling to navigate to the top of, if they can, or at least subsist or survive in this employment system. Race, ethnicity, and class largely shape basically who's able to succeed in relative terms within the prison labor market. There is very much so a hierarchy of jobs, and it's a hierarchy in terms of absolutely pay, which can vary from $0 an hour all the way up to several dollars an hour, with most people falling somewhere in between or closer to the bottom of that. But also in terms of conditions and the way people are treated within those workplaces. There's lots more I can say about this, and some of you have already heard me speak at length about this elsewhere. But an underlying challenge here that I just want to emphasize is that these workers, these laborers, while they are workers and vital workers, they're not recognized as employees under the law. That's where some of my policy thoughts are going to come in. Now, following from that project, I had lots of questions about what we could think of as like the socio-legal roots of the challenges and conditions and harsh experiences, let's say, of today's prison workers. And so that leads me to my ongoing project, which is a historical analysis of essentially incarcerated laborers' efforts to advocate for themselves, to attempt to unionize and secure their rights as not only workers or employees, but truly as people in the eyes of the state and the institution and society writ large. So like I said, this is ongoing, but based on some preliminary findings here, hopefully this can also help contextualize some of my policy thoughts. I prioritize here materials produced by prison union organizers themselves. The time period is situated essentially across the 1970s, because that's when a lot of this labor organizing was happening. It ends in 1979, which is a couple years after a very decisive Supreme Court case, Jones v. North Carolina Prisoners Labor Union, Inc., which effectively established that incarcerated people in the United States do not have First Amendment associational rights. And so after that decision was handed down, many of these organizations ceased to exist, at least in the form that they operated in this time period. So I'm drawing from primary materials of these organizers themselves to try to better understand what they were fighting for, how they were doing it, what they prioritized, and how they engaged with various other relevant actors in the penal field, let's say. Some preliminary takeaways here. This labor movement, which I frankly had not been aware of at all until I started delving into some of these historical questions, was surprisingly expansive. It reached many states throughout the nation. It began arguably in California, but spread quite quickly, and ended, so to speak, although aspects of it still exist today, ended essentially in North Carolina with that Supreme Court case. The unionists behind bars at this time really exhibited an impressive degree of solidarity across various groups that had often been, let's just say, engaged in tense dynamics, and sometimes at the hands of and encouraged by or facilitated by staffers. But they aligned under what became essentially a sort of rallying cry for the movement, and that is that they are workers in their own right, and part of what they argued was their own class, which they referred to as the convicted class. Part of the working class, but also in very important ways distinct from it because of the undue challenges that they face as workers and as prisoners. They also had a lot of surprising victories, but perhaps not surprisingly, also were met with some reactionary fervor by some other labor groups. So while prisoners were attempting to unionize, correctional officers' unions, as other scholars have already outlined, were really, they were running at full speed already at that time. And so essentially we had like a labor struggle that I'm beginning to argue through this ongoing work, played a very large role in what we now recognize as the emergence of mass incarceration. These prison labor organizers and activists and other allies, inside and outside of the bars, were in many ways the last defense against the punitive excess that we see today. Okay, so those are the two studies that are going to inform the rest of what I'm going to talk about here. And I'm going to attempt to continue in the vein of Professor Bell and thinking about different policy efforts as, while arguably or ostensibly in some cases reformist reforms, very much important steps on the path from here to there. So how does this work inform this? Well, I want to give us hopefully some guidance in terms of thinking about things we might prioritize on those steps between here and there. And I want to begin with this. The reversal of that Supreme Court decision is dramatically important for incarcerated laborers, who, by the way, make up the majority of incarcerated people. So about 2/3 of people in the U.S. today still engage in labor and on any given day as a facet of their punishment. Returning their right to actually associate and to advocate for themselves on their own behalf as workers and, again, as humans under the law is vital, I think, to any ongoing efforts at improving the realities of current conditions on the inside. Now, in addition to that, though, there are still, I mentioned some of these groups fell apart after the passage or the handing down of that ruling, but others sort of changed forms or evolved into new organizations, and there are some very active efforts to organize in less traditional ways behind bars, so I also want to elevate that. Perhaps most actively, a branch of the IWW, referred to as the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. They can't call themselves a union, so they call themselves an organizing committee, is doing a lot of really great work, like boots on the ground style, at representing and helping to organize and coordinate workers behind bars today. So I think that's also, while we seek to make legal and policy-oriented changes, also supporting those sorts of groups and many others, some of which are listed here, is crucial. And also, I want to I want to highlight here a quote from Jessica Mitford, who's a 1970s activist and author, who writes that the prisoners' union movement is no modest reform proposal, no effort to gild the cage. By striving to establish the rights of prisoner as citizen and worker, it seeks to diminish the distinctions between him and those on the other side of the walls. In a profound sense, the ultimate logic of such a movement is abolition, for to the degree that those distinctions are obliterated, to the same degree the prison is stripped of its vital functions. This will orient the remainder of my thoughts. Okay, first, or second, I should say, we should abolish slavery and forced labor, what is sometimes euphemistically referred to as forcible prison labor. I mean, basically full stop here. The folks in this room and many online, I'm sure, are familiar to some degree with the exception clause of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There have been some recent but very important changes at the state level, including my own home state of Colorado, which was the first in 2018 to remove the exception clause from its own state constitution, rendering the forcible labor of incarcerated folks as no longer acceptable under the state. It should also be noted that Rhode Island never had that exception clause in its state constitution, which is quite nice. Colorado was followed quickly soon after, over the ensuing several years, by other states. I also want to highlight the high percentages here. These are the percentages of support from the public on these different ballot initiatives. And as you can see, and this gives me hope at least, these are popular changes. It was a close call in Oregon, but otherwise, these are very high numbers, 60s, 70s, 80s, in terms of percentages. But the passage alone, Colorado here being a key example, is not necessarily, right, the change in and of itself. And so the organizing continues in Colorado. There's some major cases against the state's Department of Correction and the governor's office for basically not respecting the will of the voters and continuing to compel people to work as a facet of their punishment, in spite of the passage of this amendment. So it's an ongoing struggle, in which I'm doing my best to participate. Okay. The hands-off doctrine, this is going to definitely speak to Professor Ellis's refrain here, needs to be dramatically changed. There's a series of legal decisions in the 70s and 80s that really established the precedent that, in the Turner v. Safely case, I think sums it up quite well. This quote here, when a prison regulation impinges on inmates' constitutional rights, the regulation is valid if it is reasonably related to legitimate penological interests, to compelling governmental interest. So the discretion of the state here remains quite at the forefront. And so, well, this needs to change. In addition, oversight is kind of crucial here. Just like I said, not much of a policy guy, but did my best to brainstorm here. The grievance process very clearly needs to be improved behind bars across states and in most carceral facilities, all carceral facilities. But also, I began to get curious about, like, well, what are the pathways, and I don't know what they are yet, to establishing something similar to like the court watchers, the cop watch programs that we have, overseeing other arms of this, punitive state series of institutions, and is there a way to make such a thing possible within the prisons? I hope that there is, and I believe that there is, but maybe I'll rely on some of you all to help figure out what that might look like. Okay, against the prisoner exception. Prisoner exception here referring to the fact that under the Labor Department and other governmental institutions, prisoners themselves are not regarded as employees. As a result, they're not protected by virtually any of the standard labor rights and protections that those of us currently on the outside benefit from. This includes the Fair Labor Standards Act or the National Relations Act, which don't exclude prisoners in their wording, but the courts have continually refused to apply the standards outlined in those acts to the work conditions suffered by folks behind bars. OSHA considers prisons to be outside of its jurisdiction. Many Social Security benefits and protections are denied. There's a whole host of problems that come along with this. So I think on our path from here to there, these and other hurdles to the safety and well-being and fair treatment of this vital workforce are very important. Lastly, I want to highlight, and this is really drawing mostly from my historical work, which is ongoing, the crucial role of inside-outside networks and allyship. The successes that those historical labor unions behind bars, what they were able to win was in many cases only really possible through collaboration between folks inside and outside who could help advocate for them. And I think we need to keep that at the forefront of our mind. These can be as simple as opening lines of communication to folks outside so that they can actually get the word out about what they're going through, as well as other forms of demonstration or protest in solidarity. Many of the organizations I listed earlier are listed here. Again, it's basically the same list because they're doing a lot of this work and they're helping facilitate these sorts of crucial connections. Divestment action, and I learned at dinner last night that there's a lot of this going on here on the campus in which we're currently situated, is crucial. And there are various forms of boycotts at group and institutional and organizational and individual levels that people can engage in order to help these larger efforts. So these are essential workers who are incredibly vulnerable. Just to echo a piece from a couple years ago that Professor Ellis wrote, during the height of the COVID pandemic, these were workers who were being tapped to produce life-saving PPE, hand sanitizer, even in many cases when they weren't legally allowed to use those themselves. These items were often considered contraband. They were literally saving lives of people outside while they themselves were suffering from some of the highest mortality rates throughout the country. We're also in the midst of a moment, let's say, in labor and support broadly, nationwide, for organized labor. And these workers have, to date, at least, not typically been included or considered in these sorts of discussions. And I think that it's crucial that they are for various reasons, including a couple that are listed here. Finally, again, returning to the topic of allyship here, all of this sort of organizing, everything we can try to do as academics, as other activist-oriented folks, as everyday people, everything we could and should and hopefully will do needs to happen in collaboration and in solidarity with people who are currently incarcerated, because as soon as they're left out of these conversations, we're pretty likely to make a wrong turn. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, I don't have a PowerPoint because I'm irresponsible. But I do have what will hopefully be a good presentation. And I'm going to time myself if you want to take a little break. Okay. So hello, everyone. And Ethan, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you. My name is Naima Kahaifa, and I am a human geographer specializing in labor and carceral geographies. I'm also a self-appointed honorary sociologist, aspiring abolitionist, novice storyteller, and most importantly, a September Virgo. So in a broad sense, my research focuses on the process of correctional workforce integration in New York State. And while I know we're here to discuss policy implications, which I'll get to, I have to acknowledge the surprising dearth of scholarly inquiry into not only the carceral state's motivation for integrating the correctional workforce, but also the significant impact that integration policies had on prison culture and the larger process of penal state restructuring. So I frame this discussion of my research and policy implications around prison reform of the past and what it can teach us about the contemporary conditions of the carceral state. So my research agenda really kind of started to take shape when I was reading a book called At Work in the Iron Cage by Dana Britton. And in this book, there was a chart of census data that was really kind of peculiar to me because it showed the demographic makeup of the correctional workforce over time. But what it showed was that prior to the early 1970s, the correctional workforce was rather homogeneous, being made up of mostly white men. But during the early 1970s, we start to see this shift. And for the first time in history, significant numbers of Black and Latinx individuals and also women were joining the correctional workforce. And I wanted to know why, because nobody was asking why. So I figured I'd be that person. So at that point, I knew I needed to focus my attention on the socio-political climate surrounding prison reform around the 1970s to assess the contemporary processes driving prison reproduction. And what I found was that national trends towards correctional workforce integration were heavily influenced by the Black social movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, so including, of course, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, but most notably in this case, the prisoners' rights movement with the infamous Attica prison uprising of 1971, marking the peak of the latter and a pivotal moment in the history of prison reform. So the Attica prison uprising of 1971 occurred in Western New York State, my home state, and it was a key component of the process of correctional workforce integration. So this uprising was a violent 4-day standoff between prison officials and the incarcerated men of Attica who called themselves the Attica Brothers. So the uprising ended in the deaths of 43 people, 32 incarcerated men, and 11 prison personnel. And the state-sponsored McKay Commission determined that 39 of those 43 deaths were the result of state gunfire during the state retaking of the facility. So this particular event represents the dramatic climax of decades of racial tensions between the predominantly white male correctional workforce and the disproportionately Black and Latinx incarcerated population, as the uprising occurred in response to the dehumanizing mistreatment they faced by the hands of prison personnel, but also supported by the state prison bureaucracy. And although public outrage over the gross mismanagement of the retaking played an integral role in pressuring the state into prioritizing prison reform, the Attica brothers themselves also seem to have had a significant influence. Because prior to the state's retaking of the facility, during the negotiations between the Attica brothers and prison personnel, the brothers made a list of demands, many of which the prison commissioner at the time, Russell Oswald, agreed to in writing. And one of those demands was that the state institute a program for the employment of Black and Spanish-speaking correctional officers. So I compiled a list of federal and state documents on corrections published from the late 1960s to about the early 1980s. And I conducted a content analysis that revealed not only did New York State prioritize correctional workforce integration, but this trend was indeed national. And my parents were recruited into the New York State Department of Corrections as part of that effort. So now that I kind of understood why correctional workforce integration occurred, I wanted to understand what type of impact it had on the correctional environment. So to garner some insight on the impact of correctional workforce integration, I conducted 39 life/occupational history interviews with mostly retired Black correctional officers in Buffalo, New York. And most of these officers were recruited in the 1980s, with small groups joining in the previous or following decades. My interviews ranged between 1 to 4 hours. Those 4-hour interviews were really hard, but I was able to get through them. And I've assigned pseudonyms to each participant to protect their privacy and also that of the incarcerated individuals who they interacted with during their careers. So what I've done here is analyze some micro-level encounters between Black COs, their coworkers and supervisors, incarcerated individuals, and the prison system itself. But today, I'll focus on encounters between my research participants and incarcerated individuals to highlight some of the intersectional solidarities that emerge and shed light on the intricacies of prison space and correctional work culture. So in my work, I situate correctional work culture within a concept I've termed the invisible divide. And I'm so sorry, I tried to stay away from the theory building that I was doing in my work, but couldn't do it. So, but I did cut it down, okay? But the invisible divide refers to a series of unspoken boundaries that my research participants established and reinforced at work in order to maintain the fragile equilibrium that characterizes and reproduces prison space. So these boundaries allow officers to maintain a safe level of mental, physical, and emotional distance from the incarcerated population on a daily basis, but possible consequences of breaching this divide include the threats of job termination, escapes, physical violence, and even deaths in extreme cases. My participants also introduced me to this idea that they call tipping the jail, which basically means to cause a riot, and they describe this as the ultimate consequence of breaching the invisible divide. I also want to note that while prison is often articulated through the lens of violence and masculinity, My analysis in this particular context focuses on individual encounters that show a different side of prison, a side that problematizes the idea, which was my own idea to begin with, but it problematizes the idea of a stable or static divide between certain groups of officers and incarcerated persons. So specifically, I'm going to introduce an example where a Black CO intentionally and strategically breached the invisible divide by way of empathy and care work in order to meet the mental and emotional needs of a young Black incarcerated man. I also want to note that instances where officers decide to strategically breach the invisible divide build towards another concept that I call carceral kinship, which derives from notions of fictive kinship and community policing in the sense that certain COs form familial-like bonds with and networks around incarcerated individuals who they believe have the potential to leave prison and conform to outside society's idea of like social norms. And while I argue that prison can be a site of care work, I want to note and make it very clear that I'm not attempting to romanticize the fact that prison is an inherently violent, masculinized space where incarcerated individuals are virtually powerless against individual and institutional forms of violence. To the contrary, several of my participants actually shared examples of violence that they not only witnessed, but in some cases admittingly participated in. So the narrative that I'm going to share with you all today is from a section of an article that I got an R&R on. Thank you. It's called, the section is called Carceral Violence and the Impossibility of Care. And I've decided to highlight this particular narrative because it's one of the most jarring stories that was shared with me, but it also sheds light on the racialized violence that Black COs watched happen to young men and women who they shared racial identities with and also kinship bonds. So this is one of several instances that informed Black COs' perspectives on the prison system, perspectives that were extremely critical despite the fact that their livelihoods depended on prison proliferation. So these stories, we talked about this earlier, these stories humanize the work that we're all doing here because as Ta-Nehisi Coates reminds us, you must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. So in this one tragic example, retired CO of 26 years, Brian Harris shared a story of Willie Baker. And Willie Baker is this person's real name because his story is a matter of public record. And also, I wanted to honor him in that way by using his real name. So Willie Baker was an incarcerated teenager who never got a chance to return home from prison. Brian, the officer that I spoke with, was working as a new drill instructor in Lakeview Shock Incarceration Correctional Facility, a minimum security prison for men and women. So it's basically a military boot camp style incarceration for nonviolent offenders. So one day while finishing up a shift, Brian noticed someone crying in front of the mess hall. It was Willie Baker, a kid Brian described as physically dominating at what he thought was only 15 or 16 years old. Brian described Willie as, quote, muscular, just like a linebacker, end quote. He said he was big as me, so he approached Willie and asked, "Why are you crying?" And tearfully, Willie responded, "I don't like it here. They riled me up and just said I had a drug problem. And the next thing, they took me to Rikers. Now I'm here, and I don't like it here. I don't want to be here." So Willie's youth and observable vulnerability engendered a paternalistic bond with Brian, who responded to Willie, "Don't worry, son. I'm going to get you out of here and back to your grandmother." Now, Brian admitted to me that this type of interaction breached protocol, but he felt compelled to intervene despite crossing the invisible divide to connect with Willie. So he reassured Willie that he would be his drill instructor for boot camp starting on Wednesday, and he ended their conversation with, "I'm going to get you back out of here and back to your family in 6 months." Brian learned later that his words of encouragement would never come true. When he returned to work on Wednesday morning, colleagues informed him that an unusual incident had occurred on his day off, and he was to report to a conference room immediately. When he arrived, the tension was palpable. He shared, "When I got in the conference room, all the black drill instructors were on one side of the room, and all the white drill instructors were on another side of the room. So I'm like figuring out what's going on here. So I find out that they had killed one of the inmates." Sadly, it was Willie Baker who his co-workers killed. And according to the Buffalo News, an autopsy found the teen, a New York City native, died of strangulation from swallowing dirt while lying face down in a work area and from having his shirt tangled around his neck. The confrontation occurred when Baker allegedly created a disturbance during breakfast. Now, Brian told me that it was a case of mistaken identity and Willie actually hadn't done anything wrong. But Brian went on to compare Willie's death to that of Eric Garner, as Brian's experience as a black man in society shaped how he interacted with black incarcerated men in prison. Brian viewed Willie like a son because of his empathy for the black male experience, and he concluded Willie's story with a poignant quotation sharing, "We're the enemy, and that's how they treat you inside the prison. You're not an American, you're an enemy." So Brian's profound sentiments exposed the deep-seated tensions that black COs can experience working in a crucible of racialized violence. Brian's emphasis on the we and we are the enemy is significant because race, gender, and empathy transcend the traditional roles of COs as state authority and incarcerated individuals as state wards. So while my idea of carceral kinship puts prison space in a lexicon of care work, forced confinement remains inherently coercive, complicating the intersections of care and carcerality. And despite benevolent intentions, COs reinforce state power through the calculated practice of carceral care work that paradoxically reproduces violent institutions in larger carceral geographic landscapes. So indeed, care and violence exist symbiotically, working towards controlling incarcerated individuals and reproducing prisons. So for participants, the dichotomy of care and control engendered examples of carceral kinship ending in unconscionable violence and heartbreak. So the work that I've done up to this point is really an impact study of past prison policy. And the future of this work will be more tangible policy prescriptions. But for now, my overarching recommendation is that scholars, activists, and policymakers include people who have actually existed in prison, in these carceral spaces, in discussions of prison abolition, because their critical perspectives arguably fall within what I would describe as an ethos of abolition. Thank you.
Thank you very much to this panel. Raise a lot of interesting questions about improving conditions inside, if that's the right word for it. And in a way, they do so by trying to connect what's happening inside prisons to other classic social institutions, religion, work, and family, and show the way that access to rights doesn't always produce the kinds of results that we want in those realms, or that treating what goes on in prisons as part of other social institutions like religion, work, or family are also limited in the ways that they can improve conditions. And so I saw this sort of tension flowing between questions about rights, control, and care, and the attempts of various reformers, activists to try to access better conditions through rights always runs up against the wall of security, as Professor Ellis pointed out to us, and that the compelling state interest in security tends to trump questions of rights. But rights can also potentially actually provide The opening, I think we see this, the opening for other problems, and we see this actually in our prior panel. So for instance, Professor Gurusami's research that suggests considering sort of gender and gender equality can open up space for actually forms of undermining rights. And it's partly how we conceptualize those rights and the work that we ask that to do for us that matters. Another feature of thinking about this might be a way to conceptualize it as the quote that Professor Gibson-Light raised, which is the idea that you might try to close some of the distance between the people inside and the people outside, to sort of think about giving them access to the things that people outside have, which immediately runs into this question about, well, what do people outside have? I mean, we don't have a great reputation for our treatment of workers who are not incarcerated, which is not to diminish the special hardships of prison labor, but there's some limited leverage there, and there it might be. I think there might be some limits that Professor Ellis's research suggests about like using rights as leverage there, particularly when questions of security become the kind of the wall against which you cannot, use rights. And repeatedly, we see this in the research. Another question might also be like a matter of categorization. Like if you see it as labor and not as sort of some penological practice, then maybe rights became easier to access. What counts is religion, for instance, which seems to be actually part of the discretionary problem that some of the prisoners you studied run into when security officers don't take their religious practice seriously or don't count it as religious. I think about how the scholars of religion would be so dismayed at the very limited conception of what counts as religion that you explained to us. And so this leads us absolutely to now Professor Kahefa's research about the people who are doing this work, who actually have to balance the rights, care, control, as well as their own workplace interests as laborers themselves, both for their personal sense of identity as workers and the practical dimensions of following your job rules so that you don't get in trouble. And they have to balance these questions, and you can see the motivation to care very much in some of your research, and I think that is a very, the way that coexists with the use of harm, and the way that coexists with extensions of control seems to come up repeatedly throughout the course of the day. So we have attempts at increasing care, meeting needs, even treating people as rights-bearing, often end up in increasing forms of control. And so this seems to be one of the tensions that we keep circling around today. And I think thinking about how people on the ground do it is really important, not because they're always doing it right, but because they have some insight into how to balance these and how people are actually thinking about what counts as religion, what forms of care are needed, and the way that sometimes extra punishment or extra forms of control get construed as forms of care. So for instance, I could even see prison labor being reconfigured as forms of therapy, treatment outside in the sort of community correctional context. There's a lot of labor used as therapy, and that doesn't always work that well. And strangely, this sort of there's, at the same time, people often want access to these, to work, both for the way that it's lauded socially, because people want experience, to avoid the crushing boredom of being incarcerated. So one of the questions I had was how people navigate the sort of the oppressive features of these systems, but also the importance of them sometimes to people who are involved in them. So I thought that especially about the workers in prisons who, at least it's not uncommon for people to wish that there was more work to do, that they had more opportunities, even if they are not fond of being paid 5 cents an hour or whatever it is. And similarly, I think the question of how the workers engage these questions of care and rights and control is something that we probably should think a lot more about, because ultimately, you can change the policies and legislation, but there's a kind of discretion that's both built into the structure of jobs, but also into the sort of culture of work in places that can make exceptionally punitive forms of treatment appear as control, or appear as care. And I don't think we fully understand how people navigate those things. And treating the people who do that also as workers seems like a key dimension for thinking about how they make these decisions about whether the Wiccans are serious, for instance, or who has a drug problem, or why someone might be acting out. So on that note, I will wrap up because I want to leave enough time for questions. So.
I'm going to take precedence. Nathan's going to take the other. I think Brian had his hand up first. Nathan, I wanted to ask, given the things that we've been dealing with, I wanted to ask Naima specifically because race has really come in full born on your topic and looking at the workforce, the change in workforce. Or diversity writ large, but thinking about not only who's working in correctional facilities, we know where they go, that they're going to communities of color, rural communities of color, but thinking about where you left it, with given that complication, how does the ethos of abolition really look, given how we typically the 20 or 30 years of how we framed abolition as work that was against racism, right? Because it's an issue that Black people are simultaneously oppressed by prisons, but we're also the agents. We're overrepresented more than any other group in terms of being oppressed and being agents of the oppressors. So how does the ethos of abolition look for you, given that complication?
So, yeah, thank you, Eason. I was a little nervous about what you're going to ask me, but yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I look at this in terms of the labor market and what else is out there. So all of these officers that I talked to, I was listening to some of the questions from earlier. One of the questions that you asked and in that you brought up this idea that nobody really wanted these jobs. Nobody that I talked to was like, I grew up wanting to be a correctional officer. Like, this is what we're going to do for generations. It was, we live in a post-industrial city. We had high school diplomas, we had kids, and we had responsibilities. So we went into this prison system that was actively recruiting us through this. Like, I know we talk about the school to prison pipeline, the poverty to prison pipeline, but there's also this unemployment to prison pipeline that I'm exploring. But if we take out the fact that they did these jobs because they didn't really have any other options and just look at their ideologies, they hate the system as much as everybody else. And they see that it needs to be deconstructed on a level that I think might even be deeper than us because they've been inside and they've seen these things. So I'm saying that I think they need to be a part of this conversation because even they shared with me their critical perspectives on the system, and I forgot where I was going. Yeah.
The story was heavy, so that
it was a super.
The story was really heavy. So if you need to.
And it was one of many, and I agonized over the way that I was going to tell this story and talk about the violence that they shared with me. At one point, I was using real names. I was asking people, do you want me to use a pseudonym or your real name? But I had this one interview where this guy was telling me about stuff that he did that really sounded illegal. So I was like, I'm using pseudonyms for everybody. And I reminded him, this is being recorded. So the social scientist in me was like, yeah, this is great. But also the person in me, listening to this man laugh about physically abusing people and kind of trying to implore me to join in on it as a joke was really difficult. So yeah, the work is heavy.
Yeah.
The work is super heavy.
Thank you for the answer.
Thank you.
So my question is really aimed at the entire panel, and it's in thinking about the different projects that you've undertaken as a matter of public policy. I was wondering if you considered framing or thinking about these various policies with respect to the UN principles and guidelines on how prisoners are supposed to be treated, because they lay out a set of beliefs that have been adopted and proclaimed by the General Assembly under Resolution 45/111 back in December of 1990. And I want to call out a couple of those principles. And the first is that there should be no discrimination on the grounds of race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. But then it goes on to say, in the case of Professor Ellis's work, it is, however, desirable to respect the religious beliefs and cultural precepts of the group to which prisoners belong whenever local conditions so require. And later on in that declaration, it goes on to say, conditions shall be created enabling prisoners to undertake meaningful remunerated employment. And so there are already guidelines that are out there as matters of public policy. And it's, I guess my question to you is, how can you leverage what's already in existence to compel states and the US government to do what's right and in the best interest of human rights, or generally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Good recall on that. The aspect of UN principles that I've grappled with the most is even older than that, and it comes from the UN's International Labor Organization's conventions against forced labor in various forms. The first of which I believe was adopted in the 30s, and then there was a follow-up in the 50s. And it outlines very explicitly essentially what does or does not count as forced labor, and includes like some very specific language regarding compulsory labor in prisons. That absolutely, the description is absolutely what prison labor in the U.S. today looks like, almost without missing any of the bullet points. The fascinating thing, however, is that the U.S. did not ratify that. And then the follow-up convention in the 50s, the language of it effectively just reaffirms the commitment to those standards by the nations that had originally signed it. And the U.S. did sign that one, but since they hadn't signed the original, it feels like this weird loophole thing where they're saying, like, we still agree to what we previously agreed to, which we never agreed to. Anyway, so it's a whole mess. So that's something I've thought about quite a lot. And the pessimist in me, especially with those particular conventions in mind, leans towards it doesn't seem to matter, and it hasn't historically, and it has a lot to do with, well, many things, but one of which happens to be also, I think, the U.S.'s role in the United Nations and the power that comes with, Security Council seat and everything else. Essentially, we're in a position as a nation to sort of get away with, like, picking and choosing, and even redefining, like, on the fly what does or doesn't count. But that said, I do think that your question also gets to, like, the value of not only the forms of allyship I was talking about, like at individual and organizational levels between people inside and people outside within this country, but also, like, there are large mass, international efforts that look very similar to abolition and other efforts in the U.S. that I do think we could be better about, like, engaging directly with and being a part of. And maybe those UN resolutions and other similar conventions are worth considering in that regard as well.
So I had a thought on that. Can I share as well? I love that question, and I feel that those thinkers in the UN are much better at describing policy in a way that's palatable. And so I love that idea of taking what's already in place rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. And at the same time, I think the UN also has a recommendation in place to not use the death penalty except in the most extreme of cases. And we know the United States does not abide by that either. And so, and what I hear from the guidelines, that the principles that you shared, is that there's the idea of no discrimination, and it's desirable to respect those rights, but it still gives that space for the cloak of discretion, the idea of security risk as a catch-all. And so I'm not sure how policy-wise to get around that, and I'd love to hear the ideas of those in the room who have some thoughts on whether we could ever, as Dr. McKim points out, whether we could ever work against the idea of security risk as that trump card.
Ruben?
So I had questions for each of the panelists. I'll go real fast. But for Professor Ellis, I just wanted to hear you talk more about the relationship between punishment, criminal law and criminal punishment and religion. And so I think what you're offering gives us a way around what I see in the sociology of religion as an emphasis on the kind of milquetoast side of religion that they call civil religion. But your discussion, like that's not civil religion that we're seeing, in the law and as expressed through criminal punishment, and it makes me wonder on what the kind of religious ethic, ethos, the morality that seeps into what's happening in criminal punishment might tell us about the nature of civil religion itself. So that's part one, and then two really fast. So Professor Light, you got me thinking a lot about the relationship between guards and folks on the inside, residents of penal institutions, and so it makes me think about the work of Nika Jones Tapia from Chicago Beyond, who's doing really important work bringing union folks who run guards unions into conversation with formerly incarcerated activists to talk about their linked fate, And so I wondered if you could talk more about the relationship between guards and prisoners, precarity, and also their needs. I've seen some discussion about this in relation to, for example, college access to prisoners, and guards are salty because they're like, we can't send our kids to school. And then, Professor Kaifa, your thoughts on care, just really profound thoughts on care work to me. So I am thinking about Michael Walker's work. So he writes this beautiful book, but also got this great article in AJS. And one of the things that he shows in that book, but he doesn't spend a lot of time on, are the ways that like gendered expressions of care on the inside don't follow, just as you said, don't follow the ways that we think about care. So dudes are braiding other dudes' hair, they're sitting between each other's legs, they're cooking together, there's community soups, this kind of thing. It's really powerful, really quite beautiful. The question about, though, expressions of care on the lips of these officers that's standing out to me is, I wonder, is there a role to think about things like cultural scripts in this moment? So is this officer saying what black people say after Eric Garner gets choked? You know what I mean? Gets murdered. So how do we think about? And also there's like this kind of preachy pontificating I'm doing right now that folks tend to engage in when they're in a position of power. And I wonder how you think about, I guess, the reporting of care and the role of something like a cultural script, and the ways in which those expressions of care break, the ways we think about gender, for example, and how relationship work on the inside.
We had one last question.
I think each of them have a minute to answer, and we'll be 5 minutes over.
Okay.
Yeah, so really quick question. This is for Dr. Kaifa. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Quickly.
But one of
Hello? Okay. So one of the questions I have is, I think increasingly what I'm hearing the last couple of years from folks at correctional institutions, both like folks that are in prison, but also some of the guards and administration, is that there's a shortage of labor for correctional officer positions, right? And increasingly there's less of a pool to pick from. Folks are actually not, applying to those jobs anymore for a lot of different complicated reasons. But at the same time, right, that also puts the folks on the inside in a really dangerous, precarious position sometimes, because the solution is often just keep everyone in their rooms. So I guess I'm asking for a little bit of speculation on like what to do there, right? Obviously, not keeping people in their rooms, but then there's also like safety concerns with that as well, not having folks actually employed at the facility, and even having some of the people inside act as pseudo correctional officers, right?
So
Yeah.
we each have 45 seconds to answer.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Should I start with which question should I start with?
You pick.
Okay, I'll start with this one since it's fresh in my head. Yeah. So I did kind of this is like a more of a historical narrative that I've compiled because I was talking with mostly retired correctional officers, so I have a view of the system in like the 80s, the 90s. But what I think is what is happening is that we're gonna see a shift again, and we're gonna see a downward turn of folks of color working in corrections. And that's also a systemic component to that because historically, people of color have had difficulties passing the exams, the civil servant exams. So Black officers would host these classes where they helped aspiring Black correctional officers prepare for the exams, but a lot of times they fail the psychological exams. And also we see sort of a different discussion around mass incarceration where people don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, especially people of the younger generation. So I think that's what we should look out for is the changes in the demographic shifts, and kind of, I would have to do this work all over again to kind of understand these contemporary ideas yeah, that'd be an interesting project. Maybe you should do it.
Thank you for that question, Professor Mill. It's really good insights, and I want to talk to you more about this later. But given the brief time, some first things that come to mind. Many of my staff participants, and amongst the interviewees, as I highlighted, they weren't very numerous, but some of them would often use language and say things like, it's like we're locked up here too, when referring to a variety. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it's laughable, right? Yeah, it's like people during COVID lockdowns talking about how it's like in solitary. It's very troubling, but they would use that language quite a lot because, at least in the way they understood their time in the institution, like they were also suffering from some of the same things, although of course in very different ways, that some of their wards were suffering through. And I always struggled and hoped that would, in some cases in these conversations, lead to like an aha sort of moment on their behalf, but of course I tried not to impute that, where they might realize the reality of their linked fates, both as people within this physical structure, but also as laborers, again, given the focus of the work. But unfortunately, I never saw that. One of the sort of historical tensions that I'm seeing now in my current project that arises is it's a labor fight between these two groups of workers within the same buildings often. But what they're fighting over tends to be articulated as, especially by the officers' unions, as who controls the prison. And so a lot of the public sort of facing discourses they would articulate would be like, we can't let prisoners unionize, they would say, because they're taking the power away from us. And that, I think, continues today to shape how many people think about it.
Okay, I don't have at all enough time to do your question justice, but I do think that your question zooms right in on the disconnect between how the state defines religion, how people define religion, how academics define religion, how religious leaders define religion. And who gets to decide is who has the power in that space and in that context. And I'll just share briefly that the solar eclipse is coming up on Monday, and it's going right over the state of New York in a certain area where there's a prison. And there was an incarcerated man who filed a request that, based on his religion that was a science-oriented religion, that he be permitted to watch the eclipse. The New York Department of Corrections director decided, oh no, it's going to be a security risk to have everybody out there when we have this profound human experience of watching this total eclipse we couldn't possibly have people incarcerated experience something like that. So we're doing a lockdown.
That's why I can't advise my students.
And so this one man who requested to view the eclipse for religious reasons will be the only one in the prison to be permitted in the yard to watch that eclipse. So to me, that shows the profound power of who gets to decide what is religion, what rights are available, and the state trying as it might and constantly grappling with that tension. And in this case, religion is prevailing over security, but usually it's the other way around.
Well, let's have a round of applause for our panel.